Prime Minister Mark Carney will join the formal meetings tomorrow. He will update the premiers on the state of play ahead of that August 1st deadline to get a deal with U.S. President Donald Trump. We're joined now by Premier David Eby, the Premier of British Columbia. Premier Eby, it's good to see you in person. Thanks for being here, sir.
Thanks, David, for having me.
I wonder if I can get your thoughts on what appears to be a growing consensus based on comments the Prime Minister made last week and some premiers this week that it seems as if some sort of tariff are inevitable at the end of this process. Is that how you see it?
Well, we've been living with American tariffs in BC for a while on our softwood sector, and we have seen how they can really stretch out and become entrenched. And these are tariffs that are increasing even this week on our producers. So it's reality already in British Columbia. I know other provinces are feeling it in different sectors. So I think it's important for us to dig in, stand strong for Canada, build our country, and acknowledge that we're going to go through some challenging times here.
Premier Ford said today that we're working for a fair trade deal. What does a fair trade deal look like at this point with sort of the changes, the erratic sort of way this has gone, and the possibility that tariffs could be a feature and not a bug?
Well, to me, I think there's a huge opportunity for us to work together to build both of our economies. And that's what's so tragic about what the president's approach to date has been. If there's an opportunity for us to build together, I say great. We should absolutely do it. But Canada needs not to take a deep bow to the President of the United States. We're our own sovereign country. We can stand on our own. And we have what the world needs. And we've just got to get out of our own way. And that's some of the discussion that we're having here.
Well, today is July 21st, and this was the day that the Prime Minister had said they would retaliate on steel and other things. If the 30-day deadline agreed to it, the G7 had passed without an agreement. That's obviously been pushed off into August. If this next deadline comes and goes, does Canada need to retaliate more than it's done to this point, do you think?
Well, I think for us, a lot of the energy needs to go into looking to other markets. How do we get our products out to other markets? One of the things we're seeing is the president is losing some steam at home. The consequences of some of these tariffs are starting to hit home in the United States. They take a long time to start to show up in prices for Americans. The president's making some choices that Americans are really starting to question. We can let the Americans do what the Americans are going to do in terms of their own leadership. For us as Canadians, looking forward, where are we going to build? Where are our new partners? And how can we strengthen ourselves should be our focus.
You mentioned the persistent tariffs that exist in your softwood lumber industry. You raised this publicly, I think, last week, and the Prime Minister talked about it also last week at the steel announcement of the possibility of quotas as a way of resolving that. That's not something that has been sort of acceptable or popular in the past. Is that just the new reality we're in? Are quotas maybe a part of a softwood lumber remedy with the U.S.?
Yeah, I think, it's ironic because these are some of the longest standing American attacks on Canadian jobs that are still currently happening. And softwood may actually be one of those opportunities for us to strike an early deal with the Americans. There's $7 billion in a bank account right now that's an escrow of all these duties that were collected. Those could go to grow the market for everybody. There's a willingness among Canadian producers to talk about things that were off the table before, things like quotas, something the Americans have been asking for. And if we can get some good momentum on some of these, then maybe an awareness will start to come across that maybe we're better off in a less antagonistic posture. But at the end of the day, we can't depend on that. And even if we do strike a deal, how reliable will the Americans be as partners for the long term? We've got to change.
A willingness to accept quotas, is that just an evolution, the change of thinking, or sort of a grudging acknowledgement of the new age that we're in?
Well, I think there's some sort of real and practical concern from industry. They want to ensure that they're able to provide high-quality, low-cost building materials for Americans at the end of the day. But also, it's a recognition that in this reality that we're in with this president, we've got to put some things on the table to have conversations. But it can't be our only strategy.
So on that, I just wonder your sense of, do the Americans sort of get it? I ask this because, we've seen some comments from the U.S. ambassador to Canada sort of justifying the president's characterization of Canadians as mean and nasty in the negotiations, expressing frustration over the retaliatory measures, like hauling booze off shelves, which you've done in BC. I mean, what's your sense of just the depths of the understanding the Americans have about sort of the offense that has been done to Canada here?
I really think that at the leadership levels, there's very little awareness. The ambassador specifically said that Canadians were mean and nasty for not buying American alcohol and for boycotting the U.S. in terms of travel. And at the same time, do they think that Canadians are not going to respond when the president says, I want to turn you into the 51st state and beggar you economically unless you bow to the U.S.? Obviously, Canadians are outraged. I say Canadians stick with it, hold the line. But at the end of the day, we need to get past that. When the Americans come up to visit in British Columbia, they're saying things like, I'm sorry, like we're friends, we're neighbors, we're partners. Canadians feel the same way about everyday Americans. And I think the president is really out on his own on this.
One final topic just before we let you go, Premier. Obviously, there's meetings today with some of the national Indigenous groups and other groups invited by Premier Doug Ford. There is some optimistic language coming out of this, a conversation about a First Minister's meeting, you know, with the national Indigenous groups, the premiers and the Prime Minister, should it all come together. What is your sense of where things are? Because there is a trust deficit in the relationship with the Crown and a lot of the treaty holders, and at a time when everybody needs to kind of trust each other if the agendas are going to move ahead on the Build Canada approach. What's your sense of where the progress is at this point?
Well, for us in British Columbia, we know that we can't move quickly without Indigenous partners at the table. It's just not possible to do. And so our focus is on how do we ensure that we're moving forward in the same direction, and it's equity partnerships, it's partnerships in terms of how the project's going to move forward, and it's working really well in our province. We're going to be the economic engine of the new Canada, in my opinion, because of the markets we face, the resources we have, the people we have, and it's going to be done in partnership with Indigenous people. And there was some of that hopefulness around the table for the whole country among the Indigenous leaders today that I felt, and I hope that can continue because I think that's the path forward.
Do you think the concerns over C5 are warranted, though? Like, I don't know if it was the intention of the legislation. Certainly, there are assurances it was not, that it could undermine some rights, but the way it was done in terms of speed through Parliament without even in a committee appearance for some of the national Indigenous groups, do you think the concerns are warranted, or is it something that can be worked through?
Well, you know, for me, it's important to remember, you know, that there's a long history here with Indigenous people. When people said go quickly, it meant over top of Indigenous people. I understand as best I can some of the anxiety around that. We had our own issue with the bill in British Columbia where we're moving quickly too, with Indigenous leadership saying, hey, we weren't at the table for co-drafting that. So we've got work to do to make sure that through demonstrating, like we've got a project up in the Northwest, $30 billion worth of mines, done in partnership with Tahltan, Cascade, Taku River Tlingit, leading mining companies, and this is what we're talking about when we talk about moving quickly. It's going together, and we're going to demonstrate that.
Okay. BC Premier David Eby, always appreciate the time, and happy birthday. I understand it's your birthday.
Thanks,
today.
it is my birthday.
So thanks for spending it with us here on Power Politics. Thank you, sir.
Way.
Canada's premiers are meeting this week here in Huntsville, Ontario, ahead of U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff deadline. Prime Minister Mark Carney will be here tomorrow to brief premiers on those trade talks, and while there is some optimism, there is also some recognition that tariffs may be inevitable.
From what I've heard from the Prime Minister's comments, I think he's talking about some acceptability or acceptance that there's going to be sector-specific tariffs.
That is the reality, that we won't get to zero on each and every topic. The goal is to get as close to zero on as many items that we possibly can.
The ideal situation would be no tariffs, but like I said, if there are some, we need to have assurance that we'll keep this agreement for 3-5 years.
Okay, we're going to start there today with the Power Panel. Jonathan Kalis was a Quebec advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Lisa Raitt is a former Conservative cabinet minister, and Brad Levine is a former national campaign director for the NDP. Good to see you, gang. Lisa, you know, if this consensus is accurate, I mean, there are tariffs. I guess the consensus is that they could be more permanent and enduring than hoped. I guess that leaves the question of how big, how broad, and how bad. And what do you do about it? What's your thoughts on what the premiers are all saying here today?
Well, I think the premiers are very sophisticated. I think that they also knew and understood that when Donald Trump kept saying that a tariff is easier, I want to have a tariff, I love tariffs, that in the backs of their minds and hearts, they knew that eventually we would get to this point today, which is there is going to be a tariff from the United States. And now it's about trying to make sure that sectors are treated fairly and that the damage to these sectors is going to be something that's mitigated by the provinces and by the federal government itself. So we are now down to brass tacks, looking at what the deal may possibly look like and trying to figure out the mitigation in the short term and hopefully some thinking about what the long-term plan is going to be.
Well, John, I think we started to see some of the mitigation, at least the medium-term plan last week with the steel announcement, right? The closing of markets, the supports for transition, to help the domestic industry sort of restructure a bit. But if that has to happen in multiple sectors of the economy, that's going to be expensive and difficult as a result of all of this, it seems.
Yeah, and when you hear them, the premiers, they seem to be more or less on the same page. Yes, they're saying similar things, but they're all talking a little bit about what's sort of near and dear to their hearts. You know, Francois Legault said it, you know, I want to make sure that the industries that are most important to me, or the sectors, or the French language and culture, certainly dairy, that those get protected. So if each province starts to say, well, what about my issue? What about my sector that's most vulnerable? It could fall apart, at least to an extent. I like the fact that they're all going in at least on the same page. And if the overall message is from the federal government, we're going to support whoever is left out or who's left in on the tariffs, at least that'll keep some unity in all of this.
Brad, how do you see it? I mean, there is sort of a grudging acceptance that the president is going to kind of do what the president is going to do. We heard from Francois Legault there that he hopes there would be a duration on whatever it is that Trump does of 3 to 5 years so they can plan and adapt. But I don't know if you can take anything, you know, at face value right now with the way the government is operated. I mean, what do you make of what the U.S. government, I should say? What do you make of what we're hearing from the premiers here in the Muskokas?
Yeah, well, I take Premier Legault's point that, you know, the business community, the investment community needs some assurances. The question is, how long is that duration? Does it go past the Trump presidency? You know, there's a couple of milestones along the way. One is we've got midterm elections. We'll see what that does. Then we've got the, you know, what we're assuming is that we've got another 3.5 years of this Trump mandate. Why would you go beyond that? I don't know. You want to maybe ensure that the next president, you know, might be a little bit more open to free trade. But, you know, one of the interesting things that we're seeing of the Americans, both from the Democrats and many Republicans, is that there's not a lot of free traders in that Congress. Not a lot of people talking about the way trade used to be talked about just a couple of decades ago, eliminating these barriers. So we'll see. And I think the other thing that is of great interest, especially when you're talking to Premier Eby from British Columbia, the notion that quotas are another acceptance. You know, so I think we're hearing a lot of acceptance about inevitable tariffs, but we're also hearing inevitability about quotas as they may be part of it. I think they're laying the groundwork so that there's no surprises if they do get to a deal in the next couple of weeks.
Well, Lisa, it sounds like a lot of the things that are being considered, like, you know, the idea of quotas on softwood lumber, you know, the idea of a need to fundamentally restructure domestic steel, it's kind of picking the best of bad options while also then trying to do the building agenda and the trade expansion agenda to offset some of this. But it is sort of imposed difficult choices that Canada is dealing with right now.
Yeah, so a 10% tariff across all sectors is probably going to take 0.5 point to 1.5 points off of our GDP. But how that manifests across sectors is disproportionate. So the ones that you just mentioned, David, are the ones that are really going to feel it. And that's when politics comes part of the picture. You know, where is it in the country that's going to be feeling? Who is most trade exposed? Quebec and Ontario. Those are going to be really important political places, both for the Liberal Party and for the Conservative Party. And there's going to be a lot of attention given in those two spaces to make sure that we don't have an economic meltdown in these two economic powerhouses in the country, because that will have an impact on everybody, quite frankly.
So, Jono, how do you calibrate this going forward? Because today is July 21st. This was supposed to be the day. The Prime Minister said that after they agreed to the 30-day horizon at the G7, that this would be the day he would announce whatever the retaliation measures were against the U.S. for the steel tariffs, proportional to whatever progress was made. That's now pushed off to the 1st of August. Do you come back hard because it's cathartic and makes people feel good? Do you go softer, recognizing that tariffs are a circular firing squad that hurts everybody? You know, how do you approach this going forward if you're the national government and the clock is ticking down to the 1st of August?
Well, the clock's ticking down, but, you know, Scott Bessent, I think it was today, suggested that time isn't the most important factor. It's getting a good deal. So I don't know if that's a prelude to pushing this deadline back. I think it started on July 16th and the 21st, and now we're at August 1st. So at some point, the Canadian government's going to have to respond with some kind of retaliatory measures. So not only to calibrate them, but also what is the right time? If they're getting closer to a deal, well, who are they negotiating with? Are they negotiating with Bessent and Lutnick, or is Mark Carney talking to Trump? Are we feeling like we're getting closer. Marc-Andre Blanchard, we found out, was in the States last week, part of these negotiations. It's the new chief of staff to the prime minister. So I don't know how close we are, really. And let's also say that the idea originally was to have this as part of maybe a security and economic deal. Would this be a prelude to reopening negotiations on CUSMA? That doesn't seem to be anywhere close to reality. So what are we aiming for on August 1st? Even if we get something, is this just short term? So there's so many questions that we're all just sitting here waiting, and we're not the ones in control, unfortunately.
Yeah, Brad, there are real consequences to action, there are real consequences to inaction, right? So with time moving, I get the sense that when the Prime Minister gets here tomorrow, it's not going to be a seismic update on things. It's kind of everybody's close, let's talk face to face. I mean, what do you think the calculus needs to be as you get closer to whatever comes on the 1st of August?
Well, I think it sounds as though there's a lot of that work already being done. When you see and hear the premiers all kind of, by and large, accepting that there will be tariffs and accepting that there may be the odd quota in certain sectors, there's obviously a tremendous amount of communication already there, because I'm sure the Prime Minister doesn't want to surprise anybody tomorrow. But that unity, I think, is vitally important. Maintaining that sense of unity, so that the country is speaking with one voice, even though we've got a lot of different interests at play. So, if we take a look at the coming days, and there's a lot of different groups that are meeting. So the Prime Minister meeting with First Nations and Inuit and Métis groups. The premiers are meeting. They met today with First Nations. So I think a lot of tomorrow is not only going to be what's going on with the Americans. It's how is the Team Canada approach going, and how are we looking? Right. How are we? These big important national projects of national import. All of these things. Updates on how those things are going. Maintaining that unity, I think, is job number one for the Prime Minister and the Premiers tomorrow.
Well, Brad, as usual, you've given me the perfect segue on this, because Lisa, I wanted to talk about that. The focus on getting a broader consensus on the national projects, easing some of the concerns raised by First Nations, Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit groups across the country. Today, some of the national leaders and other leaders met with the premiers, and Wab Kinew put on the table the idea of a First Ministers meeting with the Section 35 treaty holders, the AFN, the ITK, and the Métis National Council. This seems to be a legitimate effort to try to ease some of these concerns to get moving. What do you make of that notion and what we've seen since the Prime Minister met with the AFN on Thursday?
Look, I think having Indigenous communities, Indigenous nations participation is essential to whatever we're going to be doing in building our economy, both in the medium, short, and in the long term. So any process that is put in place, I'm going to be supportive of, as long as it's something that is receptive to the First Nations and it's something that they want to participate in. And that seems to be what we're hearing. I watched the interview that you had with the leader of the Métis, and she seemed to be interested in something like that. And we'll see if others are going to be equally interested. But it's, as I said at the top, it's just simply essential to make sure that we are listening and we are ensuring that there's participation of everybody who is integral to the building of new infrastructure in the country. And that is First Nation communities in this country.
But John, it's going to be critical, right? Like while we do focus day to day, almost like the latest thing from the White House and what the new tariff thing is going to do to the Canadian economy, the internal resilience building exercise, C5 has to work, and they need to get, to a level of consent and agreement with the First Nations groups.
I mean, all these things are intertwined, and the situation we find ourselves in with Donald Trump is an opportunity to do things better, to do things more unified. The tone today was very different from last Thursday. So I take that, it's a couple of major leaders. It's not everybody. It's not all communities and all different groups, but the tone is important. And I think being more inclusive, having people around the table when they can disagree, but being at the table, it's an opportunity to be heard and to try to find better path forward. That may have been lacking in the past. Maybe that was what was missing from the preamble to getting this bill passed, but we are where we are. So hopefully they're in solution mode now, and that's the feeling I'm getting.
Yeah, Brad, what are your thoughts on that? Because, you know, there wasn't a lot of consultation before C5 and certainly no real committee testimony, at least at the Commons committee level, during its passage. But since then, it seems a real effort to try to build the relationships that maybe they needed to build in advance.
Yeah, and I think a little bit more of the issues management, as we've discussed on the Monday panel in the past, as opposed to I think you know, policy direction coming out. You know, there was I think the government had its own internal timeline on C5, and it needed to indicate that it was moving very, very quickly. And I think that you know, it seems like there's good repairing being done. You know, some of the reporting out of what the Prime Minister said you know, when he was in Ottawa with the leaderships of the First Nation communities. I think that I think he's setting the tone where there's receptivity. You can hear it from you know, the First Nation leaders themselves, that we seems to be righting the ship a little bit in terms of that. It's better to get this done now than to wait and to drag it out in terms of making all the various parties you know, feel like they're part of the process now, despite the fact that the bill went through very, very quickly. Same at the provincial level too. Ontario had a bill, C5. Premier Eby mentioned his bills, 14 and 15. There was some kind of criticism about the speed and the lack of consultation. But I think Premier Eby put it well. Nothing's going to happen without the consent of First Nations throughout this country. So I think those parties just need to make sure that they feel part of the process now.
Lisa, I got about 30 seconds left. What are you expecting to hear? What would you like to hear from the Prime Minister tomorrow that would make you feel better about the direction of things when he gives the Premiers a briefing and then speaks to us?
I want to hear that he's thinking, that he's walking and chewing gum at the same time, that he's thinking about how to build the economy at the same time as bringing to a close whatever negotiations we're having with the United States. Private sector investment in this country is something that we have to think about very intently. We have to create the circumstances for it to come back in. And having certainty with First Nations is certainly, that's why I say it's essential. Even if you say you have the power as a government to put this through, you need to make sure that private sector will invest, but they won't do that without First Nations consent.
Okay, we got to leave it there. I want to thank you all for joining me and for the Power Panel, Jonathan Kalis, Lisa Raitt, and Brad Levine.